So our subject this afternoon is, are creation and evolution compatible? And so what we're going to talk about this afternoon is we're going to look at what creation is and what evolution is, and we're going to ask the question, are these two ideas compatible? And creation then is the belief that the world and all the things in it were created by an all-powerful being. And most of the world's major religions believe in creation in some form or other. Buddhists being an exception to that, but probably most of the other major religions believe in creation. And until recently, this was the most commonly held belief amongst Christian religions. The belief was that creation took place over a period of 6 days. More recently, more Christians have suggested that perhaps creation could have taken place over a longer period of time. But basically, the belief in creation is the belief that the world and all things in it were created by an all-powerful being, which, of course, in Christian religions they would see as God, the Creator. On the other hand, evolution is the gradual development of something, especially from a simple to a more complex form. The word evolution is used in our English language in other ways as well, but this afternoon we'll be talking in particular about the process by which different kinds of living organisms are thought to have developed or diversified from earlier forms during the history of the earth. So that's the definition that comes from the Oxford Dictionary. So basically the theory of evolution as a theory as to how the world came into being is that life and everything in the world started off as simpler forms of life and became more complex over a very long period of time. And the idea has been around for many thousands of years in one form or another, but it's become more common as a way to explain how life on Earth has developed from about the mid-1800s following the work of Charles Darwin. And there were others before him, but Darwin seems to be the one who's best known for developing this theory. And for many, not all, but for many people who believe in evolution, it's a way of explaining the origin of life without believing in God or a creator. So I know when I went to school, I was very much taught that creation had been was an old theory that had been replaced by this more modern theory, which was evolution. And several of my teachers in particular went out of their way to challenge the idea of God and creation. I think perhaps that may have changed a little bit over recent years. But for many, as I said, not all, but for many people who believe in evolution, it's been seen as an alternative to believing in God. So until recently, many people believed either in creation or evolution, and the two were seen as being incompatible. So when Darwin started teaching these ideas, the evolutionary ideas, what was the response to those ideas? Many Christians initially were strongly opposed, as I've suggested. Until recently, the two ideas were seen as being completely incompatible to many. So many people were strongly opposed. They saw them as being in conflict with the Bible. But in the scientific community, Darwin's teachings became accepted quite quickly. There was a smaller group of Christians who felt that evolution could be compatible with the Bible, but at the time that Darwin first taught those ideas, that was only a fairly small group. But as evolution has become more widely accepted in the scientific community, the amount of Christians who believe that evolution is compatible with Bible teaching has grown, and we'll have a little bit more to say about that later on. But to start with, before we move on to that, I'd just like to look firstly at evidence that shows that there is a God and there is a creator, because there's many evolutionists who teach that evolution proves there is not a creator. So I'd just like to start by looking at a few examples that demonstrate there is a creator. One of these is symbiosis, which is the idea that two species are dependent on each other. If we look at nature as well, we see complexity of design in nature. Many things we use today have been inspired by nature. When we look at nature too, we see beauty. when we look at something that looks beautiful, we would expect that it has been made or created by someone and not something that just happened by chance. And in nature also we see balance and symmetry. So I'd like to go through first and have a bit more of a look at some of these things. Ample examples of symbiosis. There's lots of examples we could think of. I've just got two here. The obvious one is flowers and bees. If they evolved without a creator, if they just evolved over time, over a long period of time, as we saw as the definition of the word evolution, which came first? How did the flowers cross-pollinate if there were no bees? Or how did the bees survive if there were no flowers? And some flowers we know have involve quite complex ways of pollinating. So some, the bee just lands on the flower, but others, there's quite a complex process for pollination involved. The bee has to approach the flower in a certain way, for instance, or in the example of the trigger plant, which many of us know here in Tasmania. The trigger actually springs forward and hits the back of the bee, and the pollen is transferred that way. So, could these things have just evolved? Could it have happened over time, or are they evidence that there's a creator, somebody who's made these things? Another well-known one is the clownfish and the sea anemone. The clownfish is immune to the sea anemone's cells. A lot of us would know the clownfish is Nemo, the cartoon. That's where the clownfish is perhaps well known. But the clownfish is immune to the anemone's cells. It can swim into the anemone without being stung. Again, did it evolve this way, or was it created this way? And so the clownfish and the anemone, like the flowers and the bees, they benefit each other. The clownfish cleans the anemone and keeps it healthy, and the anemone protects the clownfish from predators. So that's just several of examples of many that we could give that show that nature is dependent on each other. The flowers and the bees, the clownfish and the anemones, and the list could go on and on. If there wasn't a creator, how did these things happen? Another very interesting one is that so many of the designs we have today are inspired by nature. I've got an example here. Now, we better keep these in the packet because it is a weed. So I'm not sure, how this is going to come across on the live stream, but what I'm holding up here is some burrs, which are the small spiky weeds that stick to clothes and stick to animals' fur and all of that kind of thing. And so we'll pass this one round and you can have a quick look at it. I'm sure you've seen it before. And can anyone guess what design might have been inspired by the burr, by that little weed that... any ideas what it might be? Velcro, yep. So apparently in the 1940s, the scientist who invented Velcro noticed the seeds sticking to the fur of his dog, and that's what encouraged him to have a closer look. And so from that was developed Velcro, a design that was inspired by nature. The other one I was going to bring an example along of was water repellent jackets, and that was inspired by nature because if you look at a water lily leaf, you might have noticed that the water lily leaf, if it gets water on it, the droplets of water tend to bead instead of spreading out, and you can run them round over the leaf and they stay stuck together because the water lily leaf has been created so that it repels water. I was going to bring some along, but they were all under a couple of centimetres of ice this week, unfortunately. So that was the other example I was going to bring along, was the water lily, which again is a design that's been inspired by nature. Scientists have copied nature, and if nature was not created, if it just happened by chance, we'd ask the question, where do these designs come from? And And could it just have happened by chance, or is it evidence that there is a creator? And when it's interesting that scientists today will actually go and look at nature to solve their problems. An example of this is the aerodynamic design of the bullet train in Japan. When they first started running the bullet trains in Japan, they used to have problems with sonic booms when the trains were leaving tunnels, and it was obviously causing a lot of annoyance for people who lived nearby, so they had to come up with a way of dealing with it. So scientists studied the kingfisher beak. The kingfisher was the obvious one to look at because they were travelling from air into water at speed, and looked at the shape of the kingfisher beak, and the bullet trains the design of the kingfisher beak was copied in the design of the bullet train to deal with this issue of trains leaving tunnels at speed and causing sonic booms. So scientists now actually look to nature, and so if the scientists, the people who are designing these things, look to nature, which many would say just evolved by chance, you need to ask the question, why do those who are designing things today look at something that just happened by chance? Or is there something more powerful behind it? Is nature actually created by God? Another example, one which I quite like a lot, is obviously flight and birds and flight, and obviously that's inspired the designs of planes today. Helicopters, the design of the helicopter apparently was inspired by the dragonfly with the 4 separate wings, which allows the dragonfly to hover and to move in different directions. And so all of the creatures that fly, whether it's birds, insects, whatever it might be, are all clearly designed for the purpose that they need to fulfil. I've got a couple of feathers here again. This one's off a black cockatoo, and it's a flight feather. So if we pass this round and you swish it round, you can feel it catching the air, and you can see how it will work very well on the wing of a bird to catch the air and give lift. Also, weight is obviously very important when you're dealing with something like this. And so the quill up the middle is hollow. It's all very lightweight. The feather itself is made of all these interlocking spines which all lock together, and which, while you can separate them, they stick together quite well. It takes quite a bit of effort to pull them apart. And so it's designed to catch the breeze. And then you've got other types of feather, like this one, which is a tail feather off a pheasant, which is basically just plumage for attracting mates. It's only on the male pheasant. And then you've got other feathers again, like the down feathers, which are for warmth, which you have in your puffer jackets. So all of these, again, are evidence of the power of a creator, I believe, who has designed all of these things. So we can pass these 2 round, and you can have a look at these as well. So there's a few examples there of where scientists have copied designs from nature. It's actually called biomimicry. Another one, a couple of others that might be relevant at this time of year when we're thinking about or hearing about the Olympics coming up soon, is the suits that competitive swimmers wear are copied from shark skin. And a number of years ago, the suits got so good that they had to be banned because the times that competitive swimmers were achieving in them were so much better than those who weren't wearing the suits, and they had to be banned. So that was another design that was copied from nature. Slipstreaming, like cyclists in a race, or fighter jets flying in formation as well. Again, that was copied from a design in nature, from a lot of migratory birds, particularly geese and other similar birds, will fly in a V formation so that the one behind is being slipstreamed or being helped by the one in front. And that's a design or something that, again, humans have learnt to copy. And so all of these things are all things that are inspired by nature. If we look at the beauty of nature, the colours, you've got the feathers there, quite a lot of beauty in something like that, and you can go in so close and zoom right in close with a microscope and see the beauty. Or whether we look at a sunset or something like that. Again, all of these things, there's clearly beauty in nature, again, which speaks to us of the fact that there is a God in heaven, that there is an all-powerful God. And the other thing we talk about is symmetry and balance in nature. Again, something that shows to us the power and greatness of God. So whether we look at a sunset or at the colours of a rainbow or whatever it might be, we see beauty in nature, and also we see balance. We talk a lot about things like, say, the food chain, it's something that those of you who are at school would have learnt about, and how if you take one thing out of the food chain, the impact that it has. All of this has clearly been designed and balanced by an almighty creator, and if one animal's removed or one plant's removed or something, it upsets that balance. And we see it in Australia, in our part of the world, because we've got quite a lot of introduced animals which we know have upset that balance, and introduced plants as well. Now, we better not pass this one round because it's very prickly. I've got some gorse here, which is a very well-known weed here in Tasmania and in Australia. And that was introduced when the settlers came here from England, obviously, and it's just taken off and taken over in a lot of parts of Tasmania, and because it wasn't designed to be here. And the fact that it's so prickly makes it hard for animals to eat and keep it under control. If you're ever standing in an area of gorse in the summer, you'll hear the cracking sound as the gorse pods, when they dry out, they crack and they twist and they actually flick the seeds, and the seeds can be flicked up to 2 or 3 metres, and that's how the gorse spreads. It can also be spread by birds as well, I believe. But again, if you hear that clicking noise as the pods twist open and they flick the seeds out, and the gorse spreads. So it's designed to spread, and when you bring it into an environment where it doesn't belong, it causes a lot of problems. And so again, that's evidence that creation, as we see it, has been balanced by God, the Almighty Creator. And another one of the really well-known examples of something that's been brought into Australia and introduced species that didn't belong here would be the cane toad, and that was actually brought in to deal with a pest. But we know, of course, it's got completely out of control. Again, another example of how when you bring something into an environment where it doesn't belong, where it causes problems, there's evidence that everything we see around us has been designed and created. And now if scientists do introduce a species like the cane toad to control a pest or something, there's very rigorous studies done first to make sure there's not going to create any new problems of its own. So again, we see in all these things evidence that there is a great and a powerful God who's created all of these things. So that's just a few reasons why I personally believe that there is a God, that there is a creator. And so then we move on to the other question, which I think is part of our subject now, is theistic or God-directed evolution. So that's what I alluded to before, the idea that evolution, that God perhaps might have used evolution in some way. And so this is how theistic evolution is defined. The idea that evolution is real, but it was set in motion by God. So since the times of Charles Darwin, that idea has gradually become more and more popular, that evolution is real, that it was set in motion by God. And this idea takes many different forms, but it generally disagrees with the traditional interpretation of the Bible, which I mentioned earlier on, that the Bible, that the earth was created in a short period of time and that creation was a recent event. So generally theistic evolution, the idea that God directed evolution somehow, generally that disagrees. Generally, people who hold the traditional understanding of the Bible would see theistic evolution as not being compatible with that. So what does the Bible tell us about creation? The Bible tells us that the world was created in 6 days in Genesis chapter 1. And so if we go back to Genesis chapter 1, it's basically 1.5 pages right at the beginning of the Bible which tell us about the world and how it came into being. And Genesis chapter 1 tells us that God created the earth in 6 days. It starts off in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1, and in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. And it says the earth was without form and void, and then it goes on to describe how over a period of 6 days God created the earth, or God created the things that were on the earth anyway. And the Bible tells us that God then created man and woman, and that's described in chapter 1 verse 26. And God said, let us make man in our image. So God said, let's create man in our image. So it means that man was created in the image of God, had the same appearance as God. And so the Bible tells us as well that man and woman were created as they were. So again, the evolutionary theory teaches that life started as something simple and gradually developed up to more complex species such as humans and the animals we see in the world today. But Genesis 1 describes man as being there in the beginning, in the image of God. So that's what the Bible tells us about creation. The Bible doesn't directly state when the creation happened in Genesis 1 took place, but the records of Genesis indicates that it was a recent event. If you read through the early chapters of Genesis, it's speaking about something that happened recently, not something that happened many millions of years ago, as evolutionists would suggest. That life gradually developed over many millions of years. Also, the Bible does tell us that Jesus believed in creation, and not just Jesus, but the Apostle Paul did as well, one of the early followers of Jesus. In his writings, he also mentions the early chapters of Genesis. So Jesus speaks about creation a number of times. He references the verse that we just referred to in Genesis 1 about man being in the image of God. He references the creation of man and woman. And I think there's about 11 times where Jesus references the early chapters of Genesis in his teaching. He mentions Noah and the flood on a couple of occasions. So Jesus speaks about these things. The Apostle Paul does as well. He speaks several times about Adam, the first man created by God. So the Bible tells us in Genesis 1 that the earth was created in a period of 6 days, and Jesus and the Apostle Paul, writers who wrote towards the end of the Bible, also reference that same teaching about creation. There's a few things the Bible doesn't tell us. As I've already said, it doesn't tell us exactly when creation occurred. It doesn't tell us what happened before Genesis chapter 1. Clearly God was there before Genesis 1. If you read Genesis 1 carefully, there's inferences that the world may have already been there in some form before Genesis chapter 1. And the other thing the Bible doesn't do is it doesn't give us a scientific explanation of how creation occurred. The Bible's not a science textbook. The Bible is a book about our relationship with God and about faith and belief and about the future. It's not a scientific textbook. It doesn't attempt to explain in a scientific manner how creation occurred. We've got one very brief chapter there about an extremely complex creation process. So there's some things that the Bible doesn't tell us as well. So what we do know is the world was created by God. We do know that the creation that occurred in Genesis 1 occurred in a short period of time, and we do know that when man was created in the image of God. So there is one other question that we perhaps need to look at a little bit further, and that's, does evolution occur in nature? And the answer to that is that evolution within a species does occur in nature, and it is scientifically observable. That's within a species. So we're not talking about large changes from single-celled organisms up to complex life over a long period of time. Some people perhaps prefer to call it adaptation. But if you look at the meaning of the word evolution, as we did earlier, strictly it does fit within that term. So evolution does occur in nature. Animals or species do change and can change to adapt to their environment. But as someone who believes in God, who believes in a creator, I see this as further evidence that creation was designed. God has designed his creation so that it can adapt to changes in its environment. And there are many examples of this in nature. I'll just give you one. Those of you who've been to Brisbane might be familiar with this reptile here, the eastern water dragon. And you'll find them in all the parks in Queensland, to the extent where they've almost become a pest. The parks have proved ideal environments for them to spread and to breed, and they've almost become a pest. And scientists have studied these dragons in the different parks in Brisbane, and they're all quite isolated from each other. So there's not much of an opportunity for the dragons to interbreed with others because they're all quite isolated from each other. And so one interesting article I found about this was comparing these parks in Brisbane to being like islands. So the dragons of Brisbane live in islands, just like Darwin's finches did. That's a reference to Charles Darwin when he introduced the theory of evolution. He travelled around the world and he looked at different species and how on one island a finch might have a slightly different beak to another, based on the type of food they might have been eating or whatever. And so the comment here is that the dragons of Brisbane, they live on islands, just like Darwin's finches did. And on those islands, they're in completely human-made ecosystems with leaf blowers, fertile garden beds and human-derived food, pesticides and mowers. And they're in an environment with a completely different makeup of plants, prey and predators than they've ever had to deal with in the natural area. And what scientists observed is even in the time that Brisbane has been established as a city, you can now see noticeable differences in the populations of these dragons from one park to the next. In Brisbane City you have the unique equal morphology, so that every single park, every single park, the dragons are slightly different morphologically from one another. The Roma Street dragons are smaller, but they have really big heads. The City Botanical Garden dragons are immense compared to other eastern water dragons in the wild, but have smaller heads and shorter limbs. So that's just one example of how a species can adapt to suit its environment, and again there's many more examples of that. So when we talk about evolution, we can look at these things and we can see them as evidence that God has designed these creatures to adapt to their environment. And so that in itself isn't something that should worry or concern us if we believe in creation. God has created his creation this way, and it can adapt to the environment around it. But that, of course, is very different to the idea that evolution just happened on its own without a creator. This afternoon we've looked at we've looked at a number of examples from creation that show us that there is a great, almighty and powerful creator. And we've looked at the Bible record, which describes how the world was created in 6 days. And we've seen as well that the New Testament writers in the Bible understood that this was how the world was created too. We've also seen that adaptation does occur within a species, but using evolution to minimise the power of God or suggest that God doesn't exist isn't something that's supported by the Bible. And personally, I believe, like many others, when we look at the world around us, when we look at some of the examples we've looked at this afternoon, and we've just looked at a few there, we've looked at the mechanisms that certain plants, particularly invasive species, have for spreading and for taking over the environment when they're put in the wrong place. And we've looked at how scientists have looked to nature for ideas to inspire them for things like Velcro, things like flight, all of those kind of things. We've seen that there's clear evidence that these things didn't just happen, that they were created by an almighty creator. And so I'd just like to finish off with some words from King David, who wrote one of the books in the Bibles. And David spent a lot of his time outside. He started off as a shepherd before he was a king. And so he spent a lot of time looking at the world around him. In other places he wrote about the stars, about the mountains, and about the things he saw around him. And as he looked around, and as he looked at himself as well and how he believed he had been created, he said, I praise you, speaking to God, I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful, and I know that full well. So hopefully this afternoon I've been able to share with you just a few things which I believe are evidence that there is a great and almighty God who created everything in the world.